Hey, what's going on, everybody? So, I am finally getting around to doing the legal analysis for Jeffrey Epstein, or at least the federal lawsuit against Jeffrey Epstein. And I know the guy is past, he either committed suicide or there's a conspiracy that he was actually murdered. Either way, he's not really around. So you probably would ask, why would you do this legal analysis? Well, the reason I'm doing it is because someone actually requested it a long time ago, and I couldn't get around to it because I had several other things in queue, and then I had a lot of personal stuff going on. So I just want to hold true to my promise or to my commitment that, and I said that I would do it. So I'm just holding true to that. Now, I do have the federal indictment against Jeffrey Epstein. It reads pretty well, but what I notice is that a lot of things in here is a little bit redundant, right? I think what happens is you get, past the first two or three counts, and then it just seems that there's a repeat of information. And part of the reason for this is that the things that are being alleged in one state is the same exact thing that's being alleged in another state, as you'll see. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into this. There'll be a couple of videos. I'm going to basically do the reading, and then after the reading, I think I'm going to put a series of videos, or maybe one video that has like the victim statements or the alleged victim statements, and then maybe the final video of last couple of videos will be my final thoughts on all of this, right? So anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. United States District Court, Southern District of New York, United States of America versus Jeffrey Epstein, defendant, and count one, sex trafficking conspiracy. The grand jury charges, and then there's an overview. As set forth herein, over the course of many years, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, sexually exploited and abused dozens of minor girls at his home in Manhattan, New York, Palm Beach, Florida, among other locations. In particular, from at least in or about 2002 up to and including at least in or about 2005, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, enticed and recruited and caused to be enticed and recruited minor girls to visit his mansion in Manhattan, New York, and his estate in Palm Beach, Florida, to engage in sexual acts with them, after which he would give victims hundreds of dollars in cash. Moreover, and in order to maintain and increase the supply of victims, Epstein also paid certain victims to recruit additional girls to be similarly abused by Epstein. In this way, Epstein created a vast network of underage victims for him to sexually exploit in locations including New York and Palm Beach. The victims described herein were as young as 14 years old at the time they were abused by Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, and were from various reasons often particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Epstein intentionally sought out minors and knew many of his victims were in fact under the age of 18, including because in some instances minor victims expressly told him their age. In creating and maintaining this network of minor victims in multiple states to sexually abuse and exploit, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, worked and conspired with others, including employees and associates who facilitated his conduct by, among other things, contacting victims and scheduling their sexual encounters with Epstein at the New York resident and at the Palm Beach resident. Factual background. During all time periods charged in this indictment, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, was the financier of multiple residences in the continental United States, including the New York residence and the Palm Beach residence. Beginning in at least 2002, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, enticed, recruited, and caused to be enticed and recruited dozens of minor girls to engage in sexual acts with him, after which Epstein paid the victims hundreds of dollars in cash at the New York residence and the Palm Beach residence. In both New York and Florida, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, perpetuated this abuse in similar ways. Victims were initially recruited to provide massages to Epstein, which would be performed nude or partially nude, would become increasingly sexual in nature, and would typically include one or more sex acts. Epstein paid his victims hundreds of dollars in cash for each encounter. Moreover, Epstein actively encouraged certain of his victims to recruit additional girls to be similarly sexually abused. Epstein incentivized his victims to become recruiters by paying these victims recruiters hundreds of dollars for each girl that they brought to Epstein. In so doing, Epstein maintained a steady supply of new victims to exploit. New York residents. At all times relevant to this indictment, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, posed and controlled a multi story private residence on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, New York. The New York residents. Between at least in or about 2002 and 2005, Epstein abused numerous minor victims at the New York residence by causing these victims to be recruited to be engaged in paid sex acts with them. When a victim arrived at the New York residence, she typically would be escorted to a room with a massage table, where she would perform a massage on Epstein, the defendant. The victims, who were as young as 14 years of age, were told by Epstein or other individuals to partially or fully undress before beginning the massage. During the encounter, Epstein would escalate the nature and scope of the physical contact with his victims to include, among other things, sex acts such as groping and direct and indirect contact with victims' genitals. Epstein typically would also masturbate during these sexualized encounters, ask victims to touch him while he masturbated, and touch his victims' genitals with his hands or with sex toys. In connection with sexual encounters, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, or one of his employees or associates paid the victim in cash. Victims typically were paid hundreds of dollars in cash for each encounter. Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, knew that many of his New York victims were underage, including because certain victims told him their age. Further, once these victims were recruited, many were abused by Epstein on multiple subsequent occasions at the New York residence. Epstein sometimes personally contacted victims to schedule appointments at the New York residence. In other instances, Epstein directed employees and associates, including a New York-based employee one, to communicate with the victims via phone to arrange for these victims to return to New York residence for additional sexual encounters with Epstein. Additionally, and to further facilitate his ability to abuse minor girls in New York, Jeffrey Epstein, the defendant, asked and enticed certain of his victims to recruit additional girls to perform massages, and similarly engaged in sexual acts with Epstein. When a victim would recruit another girl for Epstein,